For this lecture, we're going to be looking at two controversial thinkers, and that's of Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. So we're going to start with Karl Marx. So Marx is a name that most people are familiar with. Most people are familiar with the term Marxism. Yet it turns out that very few people actually take the time to read what Karl Marx actually wrote, let alone to look into the background and the influences of his thought. And that's true whether or not you're a critic of Karl Marx or whether or not you're somebody who is motivated by some of his ideas. So it might be helpful to start with just some background in terms of the influences on his thinking. One major influence that we're going to look at is that of the philosopher Hegel. So before you can understand Marx, you really need to understand just the basics of Hegel's philosophy. And Hegel is an interesting philosopher because he is looking at philosophy in his day as being one that everyone's arguing for a position that they think correctly defines the world as it is. And he thinks that there's no way to know the world as it actually is right now. That's not the way that philosophy works. That's not the way that coming to understand anything actually works, is that we have direct access to the world as it is. And one of the philosophers that pointed this out most clearly, perhaps, is the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And for Kant, he argued that when we're doing philosophy, that we need to divide the world into what he called the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. And the phenomenal world is the world as things appear to us. So you could think of phenomenal as if it's just my perspective on things. So sometimes when people say, that's your truth, that's my truth, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, what Karl Marx would, or what Immanuel Kant would say is that's just thinking phenomenologically. So you're describing the truth as it appears to you. So Kant says that is a world that we have to take into an account. It's the world of our perceptions. But then he says there's also the noumenal world, which is the world in itself. And so he made a division. Actually, I would say he recognized the division between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. And he says there's no way to bridge that gap between the two worlds. And so what are you supposed to do? For Kant, he argued that we need to make some foundational assumptions. He called it basically transcendental axioms. And if you don't get these axioms right, you can't know anything at all. And so we start with axioms and we build our philosophy from there. Hegel rejected that idea because for him, he said that's like pretending that you know something when you don't. And so he writes, to seek to know before we know is as absurd as the wise resolution of the scholastic to not venture into water until you had learned how to swim. In other words, if somebody just jumps into the pool without learning how to swim, I mean, what good is that? Well, you might say, how are you going to learn how to swim until you get into the water? And so what Hegel proposes is that when we are jumping into the water of ideas, we're not claiming that we know things. We're not claiming that these are the fundamental axioms that describe all of reality. We're just getting in the game. And so gaining knowledge for Hegel is a process. A philosopher comes along and he states his initial beliefs. That's called a thesis. Another philosopher comes along and critiques those beliefs. That's called antithesis. And then someone comes after that who recognizes the good arguments for this thesis, the good argument for the antithesis, and they come along and they provide a synthesis that is more nuanced. And it's closer to the truth, but it's not the truth. And then that synthesis eventually becomes a new thesis. Somebody comes along, gives an antithesis, and then you repeat the process over and over. And so what Hegel said is that rational reflection is what he called dialectical. We're just getting into the game. We're having discussions. one person puts out an argument over here, another person counters that argument, and somebody comes along and resolves those arguments. And that's been going on throughout the history of philosophy. Now, with that as his process, so again, he's saying, let's not claim that we've arrived at truth. We are just swimming in the water of ideas. We're just playing the game at this point. But he did have hope that eventually we're going to arrive at truth. Because he was, that dialectical process, he was also an idealist. Now, his idealism argued that God, so he believes in God, but not the God of Christianity or Judaism. So idealism would be different than theism. He was an idealist in saying that God is nature and God is in the historical process of things. There's no distinction between the creator and the creation. They're just one. And this idea is very important for Hegel because if God is part of the natural world, then that makes sense out of the idea that there is a goal or a place where everything is heading to. Because God as a mind can bring us to an end. And he thought that history is progressing towards an end or towards a goal. And that progression is the final synthesis. And so if you've ever heard this phrase before, the right side of history, you want to be on the right side of history, that idea is a Hegelian idea. Because there is a place where the world is headed to. There's a place where ideas are headed to, and even though we haven't discovered everything yet, eventually we will. And that's when we achieve the ultimate synthesis, and God is directing us there. So that's a very rough sketch of Hegel's philosophy. I bring this up because Marx was influenced by him, but he has some key differences. Marx was not a dialectical idealist, he was a dialectical materialist. In other words, Marx did not believe in God. He believed that everything reduces to matter in motion. That's what it means to be a materialist. Everything is just physical stuff. And humans who are just part of the physical cosmos are products of the circumstances and upbringings that they're brought into. And all of that is a natural process. It's just we're biological beings. And so if you're going to change human nature, the way that you do that is you change their circumstances. That's how you bring about change. Now, he said the elites know this, but oftentimes the average person doesn't. And what the elites will do is they will take their knowledge of how you change people and they will use that to oppress them. And one of the ways that they do it, you want to do it subtly because if people know that they're being oppressed, they're not going to like it. But one of the ways that the elites have done this is that they've created religion. Religion, Marx argues, is the opium of the people, the soul of the soulless condition, and the heart of the heartless world. Now, if you look at the difference between the elites and the average person, there's a huge gap between the two. And so how would the average person be content with that? Well, if you can convince the masses that there is a God who sees everything, that knows how they're suffering, and who can bring comfort, but also can say you need to be content with where you're at in life. If you can teach that to the masses, that helps them deal with suffering. And by helping them deal with the suffering that they're going through, that makes it so that they don't have a revolt and try to change things. And Marx says this is not helpful. The way that we're supposed to be running society is to help people get to a place that is more ideal than the world that we're into. We haven't arrived yet. Now, this is the part where Marx is kind of dialectical. There's a synthesis that we're heading to, and we want to help people get to the synthesis. And so he writes that the philosophers who came before him have only tried to interpret the world, but the point of philosophy is to change it. And in fact, for Marx, that is the point of education. So there's actually sort of a Greek the Greek tradition is sort of coming into Marx at this point, at least in this way, that the government should be about creating an education system where we're helping society move closer to the ends, closer to the synthesis that the world's supposed to be heading to. And so education by its very nature is not about information, it's about activism, it's about change. And so we're trying to help people see what the next stage of human progress is all about. And so the way that you prove the truth of something is in practice. So Marx is going to argue very much for seeking progress, seeking change. And according to Marx, if we're going to use the phrase the right side of history, it's actually progressing towards a state where you're removing class distinctions. So that's the influence that he gets from Hegel. He's also very influenced by Charles Darwin. So he's a contemporary with Charles Darwin. And he saw the ideas that Charles Darwin was putting forward in biology, specifically his ideas about natural selection. And he wanted to say, and he wanted to argue that those same principles apply in social political evolution. And so for him, when we're talking about political science, he wants to emphasize that it's a science and it's not a philosophy. It's biological. We're biological natural beings. And so one of the questions, being biological beings, that we should ask is how in the world were humans able to survive in a ruthless survival of the fittest natural world? I mean, if you think about it, we have no fur, so how are we going to survive the cold? Compared to so many other animals, we are very weak, and yet we've survived this primitive natural world. How did we do that? Well, humans are tool makers and producers, and so that's a product of the intelligence that we have. And the most important and effective tool that we've created is society itself. Now, to understand why this is so, think about what it takes to make just a simple sandwich. If I'm going to make a sandwich right now in my house, I am going to go into the cupboard, I'm going to grab a loaf of bread that's already been cut for me, and I'm going to grab peanut butter, jelly, take out a knife, spread it down on the bread, I'll eat it. It doesn't take that long to do that. But it doesn't take that long because society is structured in such a way that all of those products have been made for me. So I can go to a grocery store, think about what it takes to build a grocery store, and think about all the processes that have to be in place for food to go to that location so that I could pick it up. And not only for the food to go to that location, there needs to be the transportation. So you need to have semi-trucks to bring food to that location. You need to have people who are farmers who are doing all the things that need to do so that the products can be put to the grocery store so that I can go to the grocery store myself, I can bring it to my pantry, and I can make a sandwich. Society is the most effective tool that we've created. And that's one of the reasons why we've been able to progress the way that we have. Now, to understand how societies are birthed and how they die, you need to understand the dialectic. So this is going back to Hegel. The dialectic for Marx is between two classes. So now, once you have those basic influences, we might ask the question, so what is Marx's philosophy? And when we get here, we need to realize that we have to be careful because there are so many different versions or interpretations of Marx's philosophy. And almost certainly, what I'm going to be giving you is I'm going to give the most general ideas, but almost any of the points that I bring up at this point will be disputed. So you need to take what I'm saying here, read the text for yourself, and you likely might come up with a different interpretation of Marx than I have come up with. But this is, again, I'm trying to give you the most standard stuff that I can give when it comes to Marx's philosophy at this point. And one thing that seems to be clear is that he has problems with John Locke and with capitalism. That it should be clear in Marx. But, I mean, not problems with John Locke, and though that he didn't like John Locke's philosophy completely, like he wasn't completely opposed to it, he just doesn't think it goes far enough. So Locke argues that private property is the result of mixing my labor with the objects of nature. Marx argues that when you're under capitalism, laborers do not actually own the objects that they make. So maybe you could say that John Locke is right, like if I mix my labor with the objects, okay, great, fine. But once you have a capitalist system and I go and work for my employer, anything that I make for that employer, my employer still owns it. And so my labor is not actually making the thing mine. And so for Marx, he points out that capitalists own the production. They own the means of production, which means that laborers, when they work, they're just creating wealth for the capitalists. And so they're becoming tools who are disconnected from any meaningful work. And that is not just a moral problem, it's a practical problem for Marx, because this creates the thesis and the antithesis, which he sees as being the distinction, the class distinction between the bourgeoisie class and the proletariat. So the bourgeois are the class of the modern capitalists. They're the ones that own the means of social production. The proletariat are the average person who will sell their labor to the bourgeois class. That's the distinction that he lays out. Now, the bourgeois class exploit the proletariat, and therefore they are, you might call them, oppressors. Sometimes they know that they're doing this. Sometimes they don't know that they're doing this. But the way that the system is set up, they're exploiting the proletariat. The proletariat let this happen because they don't know that they're being exploited. And so that's how this system can go on for a long period of time, as long as the proletariat doesn't realize it. But eventually, there is going to be a synthesis. Oftentimes, this is going to be a forced synthesis, and that's when the proletariat realize that they're being oppressed, and when that happens, they will revolt. And when that happens, that creates instability, and that is the major problem. And so it creates instability, and it eventually will create a new ruling class. And that new ruling class will eventually be the bourgeois class, and there will be a new proletariat, and that cycle will continue over and over. This has been going on throughout history, throughout human history, according to Marx. And so to understand that history, we could go back to John Locke, and when he talks about, or Thomas Hobbes, when they talk about the state of nature, for Marx, the state of nature is, we might call it primitive communism. In the state of nature, there are no classes, there are no conflict, there's hunter-gatherers. And one of the questions that Hobbes and Locke wrestle with is, why would we ever want a society where there's a government? Well, one of the reasons for them was because there is protection. Well, in the state of nature, everyone owns the means of their own production. Everyone gets to own the fruit of their labor. But eventually, there are going to be people who are stronger than other people. And this is the struggle that happens throughout human history. And so as human history evolves, we eventually evolved into a state where there was slavery. There were slave owners and there were slaves. The slave owners are stronger than slaves. That system functioned for a long time throughout human history, and in Marx's day, and even in today, like you still have versions of that today. But eventually, as human history goes on, humans progress beyond this. So you're seeing the thesis, the antithesis applied to his materialism at this point. We evolved to a point where there are landowners and there are serfs. This was the feudalism the feudalism that he was referring to. And so when you have landowners and serfs, that's an improvement upon slavery. And in Marx's day, he is recognizing capitalism. Now, his critique of capitalism is not that it's inherently bad. In fact, he sees it as an improvement throughout human history. It's part of human progress. And in capitalism, you still have the distinction. It's just a more moral and ethical system between the bourgeois class and the proletariat. So in the capitalist class, the proletariat are not forced to be workers, and the bourgeois class have freedom as well. Like, everyone has sort of structural freedom, but there still is a distinction that it's easier to be in the bourgeois class than the proletariat. When you get to socialism, you will have more of an emphasis on the redistribution of wealth, but socialism is really the next step to getting back to the final version of where we started. So in socialism, you have state managers and workers, but this is the goal of this is getting back to a state where there are no classes and there are no conflicts, where really the work that we do is something where we get to own the fruit of what we do. There's no classes, there's no conflict, there's no threat from any other human to oppress other humans. That's the goal of what we're trying to get to. Now, what's interesting in Marx's philosophy, if you kind of compare this to the earlier ways that the philosophers were thinking, areas of philosophy like metaphysics and epistemology for the Greeks were oftentimes seen as foundational. Like metaphysics, remember, is the study of reality. So before you can know how you're supposed to live, you need to know, what is this world that we're living in? Is there such a thing as a should, or is everything just matter and motion? Well, Marx, his metaphysics it's materialism. Everything is just matter and motion. And he also wants to emphasize science and the importance of biology and all of that. But what's important about Marx, and there's a shift in Western thinking at this point, where there are going to be a number of thinkers who are influenced by the idea that ethics and political philosophy should actually be seen as more foundational than metaphysics and epistemology and science. And the reason for that is because we need to make sure that the various institutions of society, so the institutions of science, the institutions of medicine, the institutions of the school system, we want to make sure that there are no institutions that are contributing to the exploitation of the proletariat. And that becomes the worldview. It's an ethical, social worldview that helps us understand how we're to construct any institutions that exist in society. And so, again, sometimes when people are talking about Marxist ideology, they're just talking about this. Everything that comes after that maybe is not Marxism, but it's just the thought that ethics and social philosophy needs to come before the institutions that we create. Now we get to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche is interesting because Marx still was trying to create a coherent ideology for how to do political philosophy, just as all the philosophers that came before him. Nietzsche wants to get rid of all of this systematic way of thinking because that assumes that the world is inherently rational. And in a book on the history of philosophy by Stumpf and Pfizer, they wrote that Nietzsche produced no formal system at all in his thinking, because for him, system building assumes that we have at hand self-evident truths from which we can build. And he argued that maybe there are no truths. So in his book, The Birth of Tragedy, he asked the question, why should we agree with Socrates concerning the reasonableness of reality? Maybe reality is not orderly and reasonable. Maybe it's more like a Greek tragedy. And maybe life is actually absurd. That's Nietzsche's fundamental proposal. And when he looked at the history of the West, he does not see a story of triumph. This will be one place where he departs from many thinkers of his day. Instead, what he sees is a society of weakness and decadence. And this is connected to a famous idea, a famous statement by him, and that is the statement that God is dead. Because when he looked at the history of Western philosophy, even the philosophers who were starting to depart from religious ideas, he said all of them were still assuming some sort of Christian ethic or some sort of Christian metaphysic. And so as we work through this, hopefully you'll see why he's saying this. But in one of his articles, Gay Science, this is where he gets the phrase God is dead. He has this famous statement. Now this is, I should give you just a little bit of context. This is a story in this article where there is what appears to be a crazy man who is coming into this tavern, and he is just hysterical. He comes in and he starts yelling, God is dead, God is dead, God is dead, and he seems really concerned, and people start making fun of him, and they're saying, oh, have you lost him? How did you, they're just making fun of this guy. And at one point they ask him, so where has God gone? And this is what the crazy man says. He says, where has he gone? I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are his murderers. Now he's talking to the people in the tavern, and the people in the tavern are all philosophers. He says, we are the ones who have killed him. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns, are we not perpetually falling, backwards, sidewards, forwards, in all direction? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as though through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? So when Nietzsche writes this, he is, again, writing to the philosophers of his day. The philosophers who are convinced that God is not necessary at all for philosophy, for politics. God's not necessary. But what he's arguing is that many of their ideas are still bound to the idea that there is a God who is giving us an idea of right and wrong, up and down. And he's saying, no, we killed God. And now what we're doing is we're straying as through an infinite nothing. Now, if you ask him, is the death of God a good thing or a bad thing? It's kind of hard to tell with Nietzsche. But it does seem clear that he has elements of good and bad. The bad part of it is that it can lead to nihilism. And for Nietzsche, this is what he is concerned with. He does not want a society that's nihilistic, but he doesn't know. I shouldn't say he doesn't know. He has a proposal for how to not get that way, but he doesn't think his proposal is that likely. But he can see how this is going to lead to a meaningless society where everyone kind of just does what's right in their own eyes. Now, the good side of it is that he sees us as moving from a life-denying ethic to a life-affirming philosophy. And so here's what he means by that. So he sees there as being a distinction between what he calls master morality and slave morality. And to understand this, first you have to understand that Nietzsche is against any objective moral values. He's against it because when he has that statement, what happened when we unchained the earth from its sun? So he argued that a theistic, God-centered approach to ethics before, God was like the sun that was holding ethical ideas in orbit, just like the sun holds planets in orbit. For Nietzsche, God does not exist. And so now we're plants planets kind of straying as through an infinite nothing. That's what it means to have no objective moral values. Like, everyone just kind of makes this stuff up. And so he argues that there are no objective morals. So what then is morality? Well, there's slave morality and there's master morality. Master morality says this: the world is divided between the good and the bad. Well, what is the good and the bad? Well, those who are in power, they are the good by definition. Because remember, there's no sun that's holding the planets in orbit. It's just who are the biggest planets, who are the most powerful. If you're weak, that's bad. That's the way that he sees the distinction between master morality and slave morality. The world's divided between good and bad. Those in power are good. Those who are weak are bad. Well, what do we mean by good and bad? Good refers to things like strength and courage, sense of honor, confidence, being self-assertive. Those are all good traits that you can have. Bad traits would be things like being weak, sickly, being a coward, dishonorable, poverty, meek, gentle. If you're in that category, you are considered bad. And morality, master morality, places very little value on having pity or compassion on those who are less fortunate, because they're the weak, they're the bad people. Why would we try to elevate them or have pity on them? Society is only as strong as its weakest link. And so if we have pity and compassion on those who are the weakest, that is not good for society. That's not going to progress us to where we want to go. And so that is master morality, how it divides the world between good and evil. Slave morality, on the other hand, is different. It wants power. So the slave, which is the weak, they want power, but they're too weak to oppose their master. And so instead what they do is they try to take revenge in thought. And so they'll say, if you're an oppressive master, then you are evil. So at this point, he's going to be totally against what Karl Marx is arguing for from earlier. But who he's really objecting to at this point is the Judeo-Christian approach to ethics. Nietzsche argues that the worst system of ethics ever created was the religious approach, because that's the system that said, blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the kingdom. He says that has created a weak society. What we want is a strong society that is growing in strength. That's what it means to progress. And so to do that, we need to have a new model of a person that we're trying to follow. It's not the Jesus character. Instead, it's the Superman, the Übermensch. This is the person that we ought to lift up as the model of an ideal citizen, because this is a person that has true moral values, not objective, but true moral values in the sense that this is what produces strength. And so moral values, he argues, should work with our nature, not against our nature. So when we're trying to elevate those who are humble, those who are weak, that goes against human nature. What we want to do is go with it and encourage people, strive for greatness, strive for freedom, strive for strength. That is what people really want. And if you have a society of people who are doing that, society will be much stronger and much better. Now, I should say at this point that when you get to the 20th, 21st century and you see how some of these ideas are playing out, it's interesting that Karl Marx was influenced by Charles Darwin. But with Karl Marx, when he actually wrote a letter to Charles Darwin, and he said, I think your theory of natural selection is brilliant. I want you to take a look at my work and tell me if you think this is a good way to apply your theory of biology to society. And so remember what Karl Marx is trying to do is he's trying to elevate those who are being oppressed so that you have a more stable society. Darwin did not like that idea at all. He did not like Karl Marx's theory at all. When you get to Friedrich Nietzsche, there are some that came after Nietzsche and they tried to combine Nietzsche with Darwin. And so if you've ever heard of social Darwinism before, that's kind of like a blending between Nietzsche and Charles Darwin, where they're trying to take the survival of the fittest attitude or idea and apply it to human societies. That's social Darwinism. When you look at what happened in Nazi Germany, there was a huge influence from Nietzsche and the combination of Darwin's natural selection that came together to say that we need to get rid of the people who are the weakest among our society so that we can create the Übermensch, the Superman. And I don't think that that's what Nietzsche foresaw would happen, but those ideas are certainly playing out when you get to Germany, the rise of Hitler, and Nazi fascism. So anyway, that was this lecture. Hopefully you find this helpful. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me.